Wow, you guys quiet down awfully fast. That's awesome. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ben Fry today. Actually, introducing Ben around here is pretty easy. You'll all know him, or at least felt his design choices through the processing programming environment, which he developed with Casey. Ben received his doctoral degree from the Aesthetics Computation Group at MIT in the Media Lab. He's the author of an awesome book, Visualizing Data, that I hope you've been through, published by O'Reilly, as well as the processing book from MIT Press, and Getting Started with Processing, published by O'Reilly and Make. Among Ben's awards is the 2005 Golden Nika, the 2006 New Media Fellowship offered by the Rockefeller Foundation, and the 2011 National Design Award for Interaction Design from Cooper-Hewitt. Ben's work has been shown at the Whitney Biennial in 2002, at the Cooper-Hewitt Design Triennial in 2003, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Ars Electronica Foundation in Linz, and his information graphics have appeared in Nature, New York Magazine, the New York Times, Seed, and Communications of the ACM. How many of you have read the Communications of the ACM? Wow, okay. Casey, awesome. All right, currently Ben Fry is principal at Fathom, a design and software consultancy located in Boston. His work with Fathom, if you've checked out the website, includes some really impressive graphics for General Electric, and also, I think he will be talking about this today, a project called Frankenfont, which I think is amazing. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ben Fry.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I feel badly for whoever has to come in late and sit in this empty front row. This is okay. So numbers. I'll be going through a handful of projects about my work in data visualization. My background is a combination of design and computer science. So I studied in undergrad as a graphic designer. Also did a minor in computer science and was really kind of trying to find a way of merging the two. I spent a lot of time doing UI design and things like that, and wound up not being very happy with it, and found my way to the media laboratory eventually to join John Midas Group. And so there I started doing data visualization work and got a PhD there, and then more recently have been running this studio called Fathom. And so it's all about numbers and data and working with different sets of information and trying to pull different stories out of it. And so starting right in here, this is a set of UN data about population demographics. So country by country, looking at different age groups and looking at that over the course of 1950 to 2010 and then 2010 to 2050. It's goes on from hundreds of fascinating pages like this. Typically, this is shown using a plot, something like this. And so, fairly simple. You have, these different age groups. So, age 0 to 4 at the bottom, 5 to 9 here, and so on up to 80 and over, and then how many million people in either direction. So, male and female. Not terribly exciting. This is fairly typical of this type of data. And the thing is, what you're trying to do is actually tell some sort of story about demographics and about population. And we were asked by a client, GE in this case, they wanted to get across this idea of Japan having this aging population, that there was this cohort of people in particular in this age group, this 60 to 64 range. And basically, what you have is with this spike, it's going to have a huge impact on the economy, the healthcare system, et cetera, for Japan in the coming years. But how do you go from that sort of spreadsheet to something that actually can start telling the story and having something that people can interact with a little bit? So what does that actually look like, numbers-wise, and how does, what does this population spike actually look like? So here we've taken that really basic format of just this stacked chart in those from the previous image and done a very simple interactive thing. So we have Japan up at the top, the US down at the bottom. We could do Italy, Germany, France, and basically across these different countries, being able to see just what this population profile looks like over time. over here we have superimposed the numbers for Japan and the US so we can see things like, Japan's spike is here just as the US is dipping, and so on, going left to right time-wise there. But then just adding a little bit of interaction, we can play that forward. So here's going through to 2050 using the UN population data, or we can actually just go back to 1950 and play it all the way forward. So just a very simple set of things that have been done around trying to take this spreadsheet that's tens of thousands of cells and just all of these numbers, and instead turning it into something that very simply you can start just interacting with that data and say, so back to our original story, here's Japan in 2010, and as we start moving that forward, here's this larger population, this set of people who are all aging, and what's that can actually, how will that impact the economy and the healthcare system and so on. So a lot of times it's very simple stories like this to be able to just get across something that actually that you can engage with a little bit more than just all the numbers. You can imagine that to do this in text, you have to do a great deal of explanation about what this actually looks like, and instead just giving somebody things that are as simple as a little slider like this can help them engage a little bit more directly. Looking at another type of data set, sometimes you just want to see like a much broader set of what's actually happening in that data. And so here's, this is the Fortune 500. So Fortune magazine has this list of 500 companies, the top 500 companies in the US that are publicly held. And they've done this ever since 1955. And so starting over the left-hand side, we have all 500 companies listed top to bottom. And then heading over towards I think 2011 is the final column there. And each of the widths are just the names of the company done very, very tiny. And simply by clicking on each of these points, we can see sort of the ups and downs of all of these different companies. And so what we get is some fairly shocker. What we get is from this right-hand side is a lot of some fairly typical stories, kind of what you would expect. Ford Motor Company having a little bit of trouble. The rise of Hewlett-Packard, I think the more recent years have not been very good to them. Berkshire Hathaway, this one is kind of my favorite. So Warren Buffett, who runs Berkshire Hathaway, refused to get involved in the dot-com boom. And everyone's like, oh, you're an idiot. And then he kind of took off and said, oh, no, I'm not. I'm a billionaire. Going through some of the other, so General Motors, something happened. AIG, it's one of these, things not going very well. On the other hand, from the opposite side of the diagram, basically we have the US moving away from different industries. And so how the US as a country has moved away from manufacturing, heavy equipment. So here's Bethlehem Steel. Moving down a little bit further, Goodyear Tire and Rubber. Navistar, this is a maker of heavy farm equipment. And so a lot of times what we'll do is start by making something like this. Is just basically a sketch to try and just take an inventory of what's in all of the data and start using that as a way to figure out what are interesting stories to actually tell inside of that data set. And so that's where this started, and the idea was build this thing that allowed us to just kind of see the overview, and then we would come back later and say, well, really the interesting thing that's happening here is that sector by sector there's been a real shift in the US amongst US companies, and the different sectors and their impact on the US economy over this time stretch from 1955. And so instead we would build something that really focuses on that. In reality, in this particular case, I ran out of time, and so wound up just kind of cleaning it up a little bit and putting it online, and adding a couple other views. So here's each of the companies by revenue. They changed the criteria for which companies could be included, and so revenues kind of have an artificial spike there. Profit is also kind of interesting because you can really see some of these companies most involved in the economic crisis of the last few years, and just the impact in just, so here's AIG again. And very quickly we're able to pull this story out of, again, this is about 80 or 90,000 data points, and I can just, using some simple interactions, actually start seeing what's happening in there. In a similar vein, sometimes it's just interesting to see what all of the data looks like, or that in a particular data set there's a story or an image that you don't really actually have to do anything to it to really pull that out of it. And that this piece here, what's happening is this is all of the streets in the US and in the lower 48 states. So it's a few 100 million different road segments all just plotted out. And one of the things that happens here is, first the obvious thing, it just the density around different cities. So here's Chicago and there's Detroit. Let's see, I think this is probably Ann Arbor here where I grew up. Here's the Bay Area, so San Francisco, that's San Francisco Bay, and then the densely populated area directly around it. And then as you head east, you're into the mountains, and so it's a little bit more kind of mixed up. But the really wonderful thing is basically, so here's the Appalachian Mountains, defined by streets avoiding them. So no actual geographic features have been added to the map. Instead, it's just, it pops out of the data simply by just kind of plotting it out. And so this is kind of this is always a nice thing when you actually have a data set that kind of, something kind of comes and punches you in the face as opposed to having to fight it out. But also, that we haven't necessarily had to add, literally anything to this, and that it starts telling us this really interesting story about, road use and population and density and so forth. I had the opportunity to show this as part of a exhibition, so I was able to come back to it and finish it up. Because it was originally done as kind of a quick hack on a flight based on, I was pulling out the road data to help a student out with a project. And so we came back to it, did this larger version. And one of the things about this project is to actually get it to work, that it's all about getting the line weights right and getting the density of the roads. Because if they're too light, essentially you wind up with this sort of wash of gray color. And if they're too heavy, it's just, it gets very, very muddy and you don't get the features out of it. And so to figure that out, we had to kind of test it and see what it actually looked like, at that scale. And so this was 2 or 3 months into having a new studio space, and about 8 weeks after I had started hiring people and actually having staff. So my first, actual abuse of having staff thing was Chris and Katie here. Actually, we printed up a full-size version of this, and Katie and Chris assembled it. So here's Katie and Chris putting all of this together. At the time, we, so we're stuck with this 8x11 thing, and problem was we hit the middle and the printer crashed. So here Katie and Chris go back to work, or back to surfing the internet. Actually, you can see the browser windows kind of flying by on their screens. And then it gets a little bit later. Oh, there's her helpful boss kind of coming in for a brief look. And they keep assembling things. And it was this, luckily this was the correct density. We were happy they didn't have to tear it all out again and have them do it. But it really freaked out our landlord, because we had just moved in, and he would come by and he's like, "So you sell this? What's the, are you going to keep paying rent?" And so at the end, Katie didn't quit, which is nice. And that's the final image. A friend of mine who works at the local design firm, or IDEO has an office there, and a friend, he came by and he's like, they have large printers that you can It's like, yeah, all right, fancy. But an interesting exercise in sort of putting all this together. So 398 pages all assembled just right. The whole notion that this, all of this work is predicated on is this idea that we're really not going to have less data. There is no, like people talk a lot about ever increasing amount of data we deal with every day, and this fire hose of information, and this information overload and all that, and that that's all fine, and we do have ever more data, but I think the most important thing is actually that we're not actually going the opposite direction. And so there's this data visualization work or information design. These types of topics are really something of a necessity. That it's gone from 10 to 15 years ago where I started doing my research, and I would introduce kind of this is data, and there's this sort of data problem happening, and that we have too much information to deal with, and visualization is a way to deal with it. And now it's kind of gotten to a point of clients or potential clients actually asking for data visualization work directly. And so it's that they're kind of terrified by how much data they're actually having to deal with, and really looking for solutions for fighting through that. In my time at the Media Laboratory and also doing a postdoc, I studied a lot about genetics. So in between my master's and PhD, in 2000, there was this big announcement about, the first draft of the human genome was published. This seemed like this really wonderful, mess to try and sort out and see what was actually happening within this data set, because also that it works on a number of different levels. That one, you have this idea of just simply the scale of it, so the geeky part of like, boy, 3.1 billion letters of DNA, and then billions of other annotations and things that go on top of that. And what does that actually mean, and how do we start sorting through that? But also this interesting societal layer to it, as far as nobody actually when they had this announcement about the completion of this rough draft of the genome, nobody really knows what that means. And so and really, like in scientific terms, it's kind of they got to this certain point, and really all they've done is dug a much deeper hole for themselves as far as having that much more work to do. That what else is interesting and happening there. In starting that work, I took a number of courses in genetics, and would kind of sit in class and hear things like there's 3.1 billion letters of DNA, and 97% of it is a very small percentage of it is actually coding, or actually, and so, what does that actually look like in the end? And so I started doing experiments around that, where just plotting out, well, what does a few million letters look like? Started with this 3-letter font, printing things 37.5 letters per inch in either direction, so lots of A's and C's and G's and T's, and then coloring it based on how whether it was actually a coding section of the genome or not. And this was helpful for just getting a sense of scale for how things go together, and that had a chance to show this as part of the Designing the Elastic Mind exhibition in New York at the MoMA a couple years ago. And so this wall, which you can see about a third of, is all 72 million letters of DNA from chromosome 18. So 72 million versus 3.1 billion for the entire thing, and this is completely covering the wall, and you can just barely read it if you actually stand up directly next to the wall. This image was from the New York Times, that they had a slideshow about the exhibition. I was like, oh wow, this is exciting. They have my piece on the front of the slideshow, and I'm getting a little shout out, and it's like, actually no, there just happened to be this type on top of it that was interesting. And so that was also kind of fascinating, though, because that meant that was sort of the entry point for the exhibition for a lot of people. And so it also meant that a lot of people took pictures of themselves with this piece, sort of perhaps also not realizing that it was actually a work. And so I went digging for those. And so here's some folks thinking deep thoughts. These guys, sort of picture to send home to mom. This guy had a really good time. And in other cases, so those were, that was one of a number of different sketches that were basically about trying to understand some basic just notion of scale. So what does a few million letters look like? And this, on the other hand, was a piece of software developed in collaboration with a couple of scientists at MIT and Harvard, which was, how do you track down natural selection across, entire chromosome and so on. And so very different feel and very different aesthetic, but still this idea of how do I, get through an enormous amount of information. And then on the other side of the scale, really from the largest print thing, is how do you take all of that information and put it into a mobile device? So, we have these amazing, mobile phones and so on that have just incredible performance. And so here's the entire genome just running on a mobile phone. And so I can select a chromosome out of the top, and I can, zoom through it using, by tapping around and see where different genes are. And here's all the DNA running across the bottom. So if you spend enough time with it, you can get through all 3.1 billion letters. But the idea that you could actually do this with such a limited platform, it's a bit astonishing as far as the types of things that we can do in terms of computation with even just the what are now our simplest devices. Back on another axis for this type of work, this was related to some of the other technical work that I had done in collaboration with scientists, but this was done put together for a magazine article. And so it's just, here's a sequence of DNA, and then it's lining it up against a dozen different mammals. And so it's colored based on if it matches the human or not. And so completely different setting that it's just intended to be an illustration for a magazine. And same thing here. And so the thing is, I enjoy working across each of these different domains. So doing an illustration thing, doing an interactive software bit, doing something that's a tool that scientists are actually going to use to try and do real work with. And that they each kind of inform one another, and that it's all about kind of these different audiences that use the information in different ways. And one of the things that often gets, the data visualization work or just design work in general get caught up in is this, aesthetics versus function debate, and that that it's often, sort of assumed that these are sort of these adversaries. Hopefully, there's at least kind of a bit of a spectrum to it, that it's not sort of an either-or situation. Going back to an illustration type piece, for instance, this was another magazine illustration looking at this gene called FOXP2. So in our cells, we have about 20,000 different genes. And comparing us to the chimp, we have about 98% identical DNA. One particular difference between us and chimps is the fact that we have spoken language. And spoken language has been tied to this particular gene called FOXP2. Not necessarily definitively, but as definitive as things get in science. And basically what happens is, in this FOXP2 gene, if you take the human version of it and the chimp version of it and line them all up, and you look at just the single letter changes that are different between humans and chimps, there are 9 of them. So 72,000 letters of DNA for this particular gene that is believed to be connected to language. And at some point in our evolution, this section in particular, as these DNA strands were recombining, something went slightly awry, and things kept copying a little bit longer. And so now we have this, based on just these changes, that could be the difference between us and chimps as far as having language. And so a bit astonishing, but it's also this was part of the interesting thing about working with scientific work, because that's sort of a caricature version of how all that goes together, but really a wonderful sort of story about, what does that actually mean if it's sort of 9 single letter changes. And in fact, Some people only have 7 or 8 of those changes, and so what does that mean? Lots of people say, I know some of those people. This is what the piece looks like up close, and then this is back a bit further. And so I enjoy being able to try and develop things like this that are more about kind of drawing people into that data, or being able to tell a story around what is fairly mundane A and C and G and T information. So back to our aesthetics and function, I think ideally we're not working across this mutually exclusive sort of thing, and really maybe it's you have these different axes that sometimes it's a bit more on the aesthetic side, sometimes it's a bit more on the function side. The problem is this doesn't actually work in practice. So for any of for instance the client work that we do, or any of the projects that I've developed over time, that it's really not been the trying to like it's aesthetics and function are kind of the easiest things to balance, as opposed to really figuring out who the audience is. So in the case of like a magazine illustration, how do you make that different than what goes in front of a scientist, but make each of them compelling for that particular audience and have them engage the way that you want them to. Context of use is important. In one case you have a printed artifact. In other cases you have, something like the mobile phone project. Do you actually want the entire human genome on the mobile phone, and what do you do with it? And so that one's kind of stuck at that point, that it's sort of an interesting technology thing, but there isn't necessarily an appropriate context of use for it in terms of what the right setting is. And also just issues, typical issues of time in terms of if I have a week to build it or a month to build it, or a client says we needed it a week or 2 or 3 ago. And then in other settings, this was a piece that wound up in a film that I thought it would be interesting to do this sort of Charles and Ream style powers of 10, kind of fly into the genome and start out at the chromosomes and then go in further and see the genes and then see the letters and so on. This is a terrible way to actually look at the genome, as it turns out. And probably just that scientists, you'll just get seasick. And also you don't learn a lot in terms of making those movements. It did wind up, a friend who worked on the Hulk got it placed at, so here's Nick Nolte figuring out like why his son is turning green, and using this important tool for tracking down genetic variation and so on. So just fun to kind of work across different contexts. From Nick Nolte to Darwin. I was interested a few years ago about the story of Darwin's Origin of Species, and that a friend of mine had told me about how it had actually changed a great deal over the course of Darwin's lifetime, that it had actually grown from about 150 or 160,000 words to about 180 or 190,000 words by the time he wrote the sixth edition, which is the last English edition before he passed away. And so this thing of I think there's 2 points that are most compelling, and that one is this notion of, I think we often think of scientific ideas, particularly for people outside of science, that we'll tend to think of them as these fixed things that are thought up by people with large brains, and they kind of bring them down from a mountain with clay tablets, and they say, here's the theory of evolution, and that's been solved, thank you, you're welcome. And within science, I think it's people have a much better understanding of, it's actually this ongoing struggle of, self-doubt and trying to sort out, these different ideas. And so I was fascinated by this idea of, being able to see across these different editions, somebody actually struggling with that and sort of working out a particular theory, and that we could do that in a broader way. And the other is just this idea of, given that amount of information, all that text, that we can actually just look at that and we can see what those things look like. So I began with a site that had done, thankfully, the difficult work of actually scanning everything and converting it into fairly usable text, and built a tool. So each of these projects I'm showing are built with processing that was mentioned earlier. But in this case, this is a tool that just looks at all 6 editions and shows you the changes across all of those editions. So it's a little washed out, but this is the first edition, so 150,000 words, just sort of a Greeked-in image of it, and then going up to the 6th edition, which is 185,000 words. Additions are marked, or additions between, something that was added in between 2 editions is marked in blue, and then deletions are marked in red. And at the right-hand side, we have the actual text. And so it's a interactive viewer that lets you look at, so as I drag through here, it's realigning all of the different editions. And I can actually zoom into a particular piece of the text, and then look at some of the, where these changes actually exist. And essentially you have Darwin plus track changes, so Darwin fighting through Microsoft Word and doing these various edits. Actually, these are all kind of, fairly basic things. But, maybe a third of the edits are just, rewriting the, and, tweaking the phrasing of things. Another third are changing the, an example to try and cite something further, or remove a citation to somebody's work, or try and use a better example to convey, an idea. And then another third are just actually building out the theory, further, as we see some of these, these larger sections here. In the final edition, he actually added an entire chapter that dealt with some of the criticisms of the theory, for instance. And so you see this huge edition here, and then where some of that was found in the other editions. And so a bit like the where that Fortune 500 piece started, this is the catalog of, what are we actually dealing with, and what does all this data look like? And then from there, trying to turn that into something that's a little more striking. And that, and so this is my competition in this, that 50 years ago, this guy, Morse Peckham, actually developed this book, which was a variorum text of, all 6 editions. And while I was able to use code to actually fight through this, instead what he did was took every single sentence from every single edition, put each of them on index cards, and basically assembled this massive, well, it must have been a mess, but, and this was the book that was produced that basically looks at all of these changes. And really it's kind of limited to, the level of interest for somebody who's a Darwin historian. And so this is another thing of, can we actually put it in a format that's compelling enough that you can broaden that audience of people who would otherwise be interested in this. In his introduction, he also has this great line that, where he basically, where he's talking about why he decided to do this text. And he says, and so since biologists and even historians of science have more important things to do, and because the tasks seem to call for the efforts of just such a harmless drudge as a student of literature, I undertook to create a variorum text. And so here he's this lit student who, he's like, what, I'm gonna, professor who's gonna put this entire thing together and try and help us understand what's happening with it. A more final version of this piece was done as a installation where we have the entire text, and you can roll over different parts to actually see the words beneath. And over time, it's simply adding each of the later additions to the final text. And so, as I have this running kind of fast forward, so it's a little frenetic, but the end is a composite image of, across the entire book, what edition that actual phrase or word came from, and be able to get a sense of just, more broadly how this thing was constructed. And so you get some other, smaller things like in the very last paragraph, he actually, in the second edition, added this extra reference to God, because he, well, it's not necessarily known why he did it, but it's a, sort of giving, so he talks about, there is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. So basically, there's this, all these forms of life have, are now in existence, and he added this extra sort of caveat in the second edition of like, oh yeah, God did it. And so there's kind of a bit of a hedge there, or perhaps he's trying to sort of avoid the additional religious or criticism from the religious community about what he was perhaps implying in his book, that famously we don't really know where he was on the religious spectrum. So just a bit interesting to see how that, these different things actually come together. And here we are, this is the 6th edition, and so we'll see all these deletions happening where these other chapters get smaller as the various ways that the criticism are actually addressed are pulled out, and then he adds this entire chapter that's dealing more directly, that perhaps feeling his own mortality was trying to kind of shore up how the theory itself was presented, having relied on friends and colleagues to actually do the defense for him prior to that. So that's where that particular piece wound up, and I think the next thing, or not I think, but the next thing that we've been looking at is instead, how do you actually turn this into something that's more of a tool that you can run online, that actually you can do the searching thing and actually track down some of these things and get a better sense of the information, as opposed to here where we're kind of focusing on these overviews. Okay, Frankenstein. Apologize. I've been interested in typography for a really long time. That it's one of the things that got me into design in the first place was just typography and how it works, and simultaneously with technology, there's this thing about, in particular, how PDF files work. So like Acrobat PDFs, they have always, whenever you make something with a PDF, it actually it's built so that you can faithfully reproduce your original document. So what that means is that if you used 5 or 6 different fonts, that it'll actually take the necessary pieces of those fonts, embed them into the document, and make it so that when the next person actually opens it, they can actually see the document as intended. When Acrobat came along, this was a bit groundbreaking, that you could even do this for Adobe. This is kind of taken for granted present day. But I always thought it was kind of fascinating, this idea of you have all of these fonts just kind of floating around, in this case, the internet nowadays. And the fonts themselves are not the actual original typefaces with all the letters. Instead, they're these sort of misshapen pieces that are just kind of, maybe 5 letters from one typeface and another 12 letters from another typeface, based on what was actually used in the book. And so for instance, this wonderful PDF found off the web, as they do, so they have the headline there, so that's done in one font. All the necessary letters to produce that headline are actually embedded into the PDF. And then they, I'm going to switch fonts a little for the 2003 edition. And so that one's now embedded as well, but just those particular letters, and then they switch fonts again. And this is what PDFs from the internet look like. So this is the NIBEM clean meter, for instance. This is actually a piece of equipment that measures the foam on beer. or the Island Cow restaurant, of course. One of the, food menus being like one of the, perhaps one of the most frightening sort of instances of font and design and whatever. My wife was actually in the neighborhood with this place, and she's seen me do this talk, or show this piece before, and about fell over when she actually saw that there really was an Island Cow restaurant. The fonts themselves actually look, are something like this. So this is one example that was found in a PDF. Here's another, and this is the totality of all of the letters available for that particular font. Bad idea. And so to pull all of this together, I wanted to figure out, how can we kind of get across this idea of how these sort of font carcasses from around the web, how can they be reassembled in an interesting fashion? And so finally came upon the idea of using the text of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and taking all of those fonts that were around and actually reconstructing the entire text of the book. And so to seed that, I took all the unique words in the Frankenstein book. There are about 5,000 of them. They look like this. And with each of those words, did a search on the web for PDF files that were matched with that word, grabbed the first 10 or 15 PDFs, and just collected an enormous number of files to actually start building this out. So there's about 5,500 unique words in the book, top 10 or 15 hits, as I mentioned. So this results in almost 350,000 unique fonts. A lot of them are kind of overlaps. There's a lot of Arial and Helvetica out there, a lot of Times Roman. And within that, there are 55,000 unique glyph shapes that wound up actually being used in the final book, which covered about 340,000 individual letters in the entire Frankenstein book. So basically the first round was, first just collecting all of these things, and it's just this wonderful array of characters. And so this is a poster. It's about 4 feet wide and 7 or 8 feet tall, of just all of the letters that were found over the course of these hundreds of thousands of PDFs. And so then, in reassembling that, this was the first edition that really was starting to work. And so basically, for each of the letters in the book, it's grabbing one of the letters from one of the typefaces that were pulled out of the PDFs. And we get this wonderful typographic nightmare happening. And so we go in, it's sort of a bit of a mess. And the thing that was, so it was interesting to actually see it up and running. And there are all these really great things that happen in fonts, like these pictogram things that come up, and sort of missing characters, and just really had the right sort of feel to it. But also, as we go through these different pages, there's really nothing that makes you want to keep reading the book. That you look at the first page outside, and why not? Basically after the first page or two, it's kind of aha, I get it. It's a bit like a ransom note, and instead, wanted to figure out a way to kind of do a better job of getting that across, like sort of this shift, and also this sense of so for all these typefaces that are floating around out there, that they're not all created equal. Like I was saying, that there's a lot of Arial, there's a lot of Times Roman, and so wanted to introduce that part of it. And so where this wound up was instead of just grabbing so of the 340,000 unique letters in the book, instead of just grabbing randomly from this pile of available letters and reconstructing the book, instead having it start with or order all of these typefaces based on how often different letters were used and how often particular fonts were actually found. And so, not surprisingly, and then basically it gets more and more intense, and the characters are more and more rare as you move through the book. And so going along with the story, this idea of, it's starting out being this a bit more optimistic, and toward the end it just really turns into this, boy, something really terrible has happened. And so actually be able to tell that story typographically with this technical underpinning to it as well. And so here's what the first page looks like. Some Arial, a little bit of Times Roman, that the E's show up there. Sort of very, very blocky at the beginning. Page 22 and 23, we're starting to get more bold. So there's a lot of, Arial and Helvetica bold. Now page 43, we're into a lot of bold. And then some italics. A lot of people love italic Times Roman. And then page 170, it's starting to get a little bit more, there's something really wrong happening here. And that moves on toward the rest of the book, that it just gets even more. I think this is my favorite spread, where one of the fonts is actually just, thinks its width is, 50 pixels negative instead of actually moving forward, or some of these other, wonderful characters that actually pop up, or there's like a train font in there. There's, and so it feels really nice typographically. And here we are at the end, that just, the wheels have really, really come off, and things aren't going particularly well with our dear Frankenstein. And so in the end, we wanted to produce an actual book with this. And so we sent it off to Blurb to get it printed. And a couple weeks, we hadn't heard back from them, and there was this problem. And so they write to us, and so James, who was our intern, was helping me coordinate it. And thank you for uploading the files. I downloaded the files from PDF job number 23-15560. I'm not sure how you created the PDF, but it will not print correctly. Though all the fonts have been outlined, they did not outline correctly. You can see this for yourself, blah, blah, blah. Look at the last page of the book and work forward. It is much more evident near the back of the book. And this is signed by Joe, our PDF technical specialist at Blurb. So after a bit of back and forth, we were able to convince him that that was, in fact, what we were trying to do. But it was nice to know that he actually even picked up on the fact that it got worse toward the end, and it's like, good, this is successful in a way. And so the final book with some photos that James took, just a fun sort of printed artifact, and that we went and put it up online and made it available. And so we do these things like this, or the street map at the beginning. We do as sort of fun side design projects, and then run them as kind of charitable projects, separate from our client work, because it's kind of, we can do it as a design geek thing, but we don't rely on that as our, sort of income and whatnot. Which brings me to Fathom. So as I mentioned earlier, I've been running this studio in Boston called Fathom. We're about 7 or 8 at this point. This is a wonderful piece done by the daughter of one of, shortly after Mark Schifferle joined us. She's actually doing some data collection that involves balloons, salt, and red crystals. And she's singing the I Love Data song, which I didn't know that existed, but we're looking forward to hiring her. And so I wanted to, finish out the talk with a couple of examples of projects that we've done as a group at Fathom. And so, not this one. Starting with this as a data set, this is Health and Human Services, or National Library of Medicine and the NIH. They have this genetics home reference. Sort of going back to this idea of what would you actually do with a mobile app that has all of this genetic data? And is there a way to actually explain the way that the genome works, or what a gene is, or what diseases and how they're affected by genes, and so on. So we started with a tablet application that would take all the data, basically from this site, so thousands of pages, and jam it into an easily navigable kind of space. And so these were some of the initial sketches that we put together. This was the design primarily led by James, who was the one helping on the Frankenfont printing. And so you can just go through and look at different sections of the genome, bring up a particular gene, here's a condition, and so on. In the end, it was kind of not the right amount of data. Like it felt too kind of inflated to be on a tablet application. And so Chris, who is doing some of the development work on this, or most of it, said, let's move to a smaller format and just have the phone format and see what we can do, to get that kind of density issue right as far as how much information goes on a screen. And so we start with this idea of just being able to flip through chromosome by chromosome. So we have 22 chromosomes plus the X and the Y. And so we have a paragraph or 3 about what's actually, interesting features on that particular chromosome. And you can, this is just, swiping back and forth on a phone, or we can actually browse through the data itself. And so we can see where all of these genes actually are, bring up these horrible sounding diseases, and hopefully give people a better sense of how all of this goes together. And so as with a number of these other projects, this is it actually running, it's, how do we take this, very fairly mundane data from that site and turn it into something that you can browse in a very fluid manner, that you can, widen that audience again as far as who's actually going to sit down with this information and start looking at it and thinking about it. And so this was something that we did more as a side research project, just to try and test out some of these ideas, and we'll see where this goes in the end. Occasionally, we're asked to do information graphics, or illustration type pieces, like a bit like the magazine stuff I showed earlier. We were asked by Popular Science to take this diagram from Lawrence Livermore that talks about basically the different methods of energy production within the US and how they're actually used, residential, commercial, industrial, and also what level of energy loss there actually is in that process as well, just through transmission and so on. This is what the final piece looked like. So we have each of the different types of sources and shown in the various colors, and the places where it ends up, but then this massive amount of energy that is basically just lost in transmission and just these incredible inefficiencies in our power system. And so we wanted a way to really, kind of highlight that, but also have the rest of it striking and kind of going to that earlier audience point, just where we use kind of these brighter popular science type colors. And this was particularly interesting because it's a fairly typical data set within this space. And so this is actually a piece done by the folks at Bloomberg Business Week. This is the exact same data, just done in a different format. It's a Flash application. You can, mouse over different parts of it and highlights, each of those strains and, brings up different information, just totally different take on it. This is Good Magazine taking that same data and, again, I guess doing a bit of the color thing, but they've kind of dispensed with this idea of, scale or the exact amounts kind of moving left to right. And so I think one of the things we find interesting is basically, this is what's appropriate for the Bloomberg Business Week audience. This is what's appropriate for Good's audience. They want something just really, really striking. And then, the popular science audience, a different type of, different type of graphic and sort of our take on it. So that's Katie, who led the design on it, modeling with the magazine as well. For another project, we were asked by National Geographic to do sketch ideas about the world population actually reaching 7 billion. This was a little over a year ago. And basically just, what's a way that you can actually just pick some aspect of this idea that we're actually reaching 7 billion people, and how do you actually convey that? And the thing we latched onto was the idea of population density and how inconsistent that is across the US. And so we wanted to across the world. Not very interesting actually across the US, but just how striking that, that it's not as though we have 7 billion people kind of all scattered around the earth. Instead, it's, there's enormous disparities in terms of where everybody's located. We kind of reversed the scale a little bit. So a very large gray dot represents 6,000 people, and that goes up to a very small red dot, which represents 300,000 people. And so we wanted something that worked graphically because we needed to be able to deal with this sort of logarithmic scaling, but do it in a flat, sort of map format. So here we are in an extremely densely populated area. And so here's India, Mumbai being number 5. And we have different call-outs that basically showed the top largest and most dense cities, a little bit of background, and then just visually you can see across the span of it kind of how that density actually varies. And so compare this with India to the US, and we don't even remotely get there in terms of the amount of density until really getting right around New York City and up and down the East Coast. I guess LA would also be very high too, but then heading west, I mean it's as if this western part of the US is hardly there. Poor Canada has kind of faded out off to the top, and then the final piece. And so in the end, we had started as a sketch project. We enjoyed working on it, and so we wound up finishing it and doing it just as a printed poster type thing, because we actually wanted to see it kind of up and out there. Let's see, how are we doing? We'll skip this one. This one, a bit about looking at sports statistics that we did for a football club in the UK. And I'll wrap up with Chris and Richard Dean Anderson and a love story. And so a lot of times in between different projects, we'll try and take some time away from doing direct client things and pursue some other type of interest. In this case, here's Chris with Richard Dean Anderson, better known as MacGyver. And we kind of lost Chris for a couple days. And he got interested in this, he had run across this, well, actually, he had started watching a bunch of MacGyver that he had a Netflix account or something and was like watching it on his like Netflix streaming box, and started getting obsessed with like the different types of things that MacGyver would build, and kind of the various inventions that he would put together over the course of an episode, and the things that it would be that these would be constructed from. So he constructed Mac recipes, and so here we have all 7 seasons of MacGyver running around the outer edge. Here's episode 1, and basically each of these blocks represents one particular thing that MacGyver has constructed. And so if I click on, or I can roll over any of these and see that milk chocolate bars were used to stop a sulfuric acid leak, which is the 7th thing that he assembled in episode 1 there. The other thing is, for any of these items, we can, cactus juice, of course, we're going to power transistor radio with that. So Chris was also interested in playing with natural language processing, and so this was kind of an excuse to play with NLP libraries. And so trying to break down the different pieces of text and then cross-reference it against other recipes. So here we've got juice and power and radio, so I can say, give me everything else with juice. So here we are back in season 4, where a first aid kit and orange juice was used to develop surveillance film. Fairly efficient on the road, if you're MacGyver. And so basically just be able to put together this an enormous amount of information. So the thing that was particularly striking about this project, outside of just MacGyver's head kind of popping out of the page, we posted this online, and we actually, like we knew that people were, were into MacGyver, but I kind of figured, like, I discounted how international it would be as well. But I mean, we had something like a 250,000 visits to the actual piece within the first week. We just got just absolutely like hammered, and we're lost a day trying to keep our server from melting and all that good stuff. But it was really funny kind of seeing how people kind of connected with the whole like MacGyver thing. It's like, oh, I love MacGyver. And as far as the international reach, it popped up on a Swedish site. And as it happens, we actually have somebody who's Swedish in the office, and she was able to translate this for us. And it comes to, this must be the best thing to happen since meat-flavored water. And so this was really wonderful feedback, having, certainly this has not been said about Darwin or like any of these other, pieces that we put together, but this we figured was high praise from the Swedes. So I will finish there, and thanks very much.
Questions?
So, hi Ben, and thanks for this talk. So just curious, there's a diverse amount of material that you seem to deal with, right, from the Genome to MacGyver.
Mm-hmm.
For you personally, what drives you? What's the...
Let's see. So I got into design in the first place because it was this big excuse to actually just pursue any random thing that you were interested in. And so it's kind of this wonderful environment where you can just, at any particular point, you're curious about MacGyver or genetics or the piece that I skipped over, the sports training data, things like that. And that it's just really interesting to move between different domains and be able to kind of come across things that are interesting, and to kind of build stuff that actually pulls that out of it. So just sort of the curiosity thing.
I think it's really great that you're able to take like all these data and information and boil them down to very user-friendly. But do you or your staff on the flip side ever get discouraged that you've sat there and dug and like cleaned and processed all these data, and then you end up with one graphic? Sure. And how do you deal with that process?
Actually, the worst is if we wind up with zero graphics, because we do, and especially doing this type of work in a client setting, because it's been interesting kind of figuring out what things actually will work, as far as like what data actually has a story in it that's worth telling, and that kind of balances the, in the case of a client piece, like balances something that they want to communicate with something that's actually compelling for a wider audience. And so we've also had a lot of cases where even very large data sets, they seem like they should be just incredible and compelling. So like there was a data set we were working with that was 11 million patient records from an electronic medical record database going back 10 years. Sounds fascinating, right? Fascinating for us. But we thought that this would be just kind of an incredible, like, be able to see, sort of history of, how people's individual healthcare was working, and it did not sort of give us the type of stories that we were hoping or expecting to find. And with it being an extremely large data set, that was a very slow process to find out. And so with a client waiting on the other end of that, that's also a very difficult thing to balance. And so, so there's that part of it. And I think, more to your original question though, I think it's like so much of this, it's a lot like writing, that it's kind of, you can research a topic and you want to be able to pick a particular story, a particular narrative that you want to actually convey. And one of the things I've enjoyed is being able to, occasionally come back and do different narrative, slices on things. So the Darwin project kind of starting with, this is what the data looks like, then moving to, here's an installation that can go in a museum, and then later moving to, well, and here's how we could actually put this in front of students that, or historians, that they could actually work with it and, think with the data. And so sometimes we can do that, and then other times it's, we mine something out as best we can, and then based on what we learn, we try harder on the next piece based on, something else that we might want to look at or find or, pursue further.
Next question.
Thanks for the amazing presentation. And I won't think those are amazing graphics in context of scientific research and complex system science. So in a way, we know these days there's a really complex phenomenon which we cannot really reach with our understanding, not only because we don't reach data, but also because of the not only a quantitative amount, but qualitative difference of the huge amount of interconnection. Then there's one scenario, for example, for like a human brain. We could one day identify all the activity and simulate all the activity, but we might not be able to still understand anything.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's, as a phenomenon, that's totally different type of different quality of kind of phenomenon. Through your practice, did you sense in certain kind of type of data shows that type of qualitative difference which is really difficult for humans to understand?
In terms of, are there particular data sets that are that much more difficult or more interesting to pursue because we understand less about them, or?
Some area which our technique of kind of reducing information to show other people wouldn't really work. Some totally different approach would be missing.
I think kind of back to the writing example, so are there things you can express in writing out a narrative, or that you're always kind of dealing with a massive amount of stuff and trying to turn that into something that can actually be conveyed. And so I think there is that is a fundamentally human intellectual exercise of, we always we have to be able to be good at distilling things. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's necessarily a limit on that. I think we're a long ways from there being good visualization methods and tools that get us there as quickly as we should. And even with the analytic types of things that we can do, I think we're a long ways off on that. So, for instance, with the Darwin project, that at the risk of undermining any, you're actually thinking might be interesting or something, that the thing that really should happen is that it's not the word, sentence to sentence and word to word changes that happens over the course of these 6 editions. It's actually 30 years of his sketchbooks and writing and all of these things that he's put together that basically fed into, so he was doing that for 20 or 25 years before actually putting together this one first edition of the book. And that started with an essay, which then became the intro and the first chapter and so on. And so we're a long ways or not long ways, but to start looking at those issues of how you would actually trace all of those paths. That's very, very difficult. It's very difficult in terms of actually collecting that data, actually matching up same to same with different things, and actually putting that in front of people. And so, yeah. So in a lot of cases, we're really just starting to play with these methods.
I was wondering if there's a conflict at all that you find. That's basically like. Yeah, sorry. Well, it just kept going out. Okay. So just you were talking about aesthetics and function, and I want to know in your work how much tool building do you do that's going to be for the client for them to maintain? So, and how much is that incorporated in your aesthetics? Because like when we looked at like the Darwin thing and some other examples, it's like a finite data set.
Sure,
There's not
yeah.
going to be adding any more words
Yep.
to Darwin. So you can just present that and it's great.
Hopefully not.
But like I'll just give the anecdote. I used to work for a county government and we had a contractor build like a web map with us. They were doing like the programming and the work with the server and everything and writing everything. And we were doing the design and a little bit
Yeah.
of both. So it just seemed, do you do stuff
So
where you do everything together or?
Yeah, there's a number of different answers. The really short, cynical one is like whatever the client will pay for. But the more accurate version has something to do with what actually makes sense for that particular project and that domain. In general, like in some cases, we are hired to build the more general tools. I left out a bunch of general tool work because in a talk setting, it doesn't really work because I have to like do 15 minutes of introduction to like natural selection and tracing variation in the genome, and before getting to this fairly mundane tool that people were using to do science. So in some cases, there is more of a, it needs to work on a larger basis like that. It's more tool oriented. Second thing is, part of the reason that I like working with computation as a designer is simply this idea of, instead of thinking of the final piece as being this kind of fixed thing that I design just so, that instead it can be actually software can be this kind of living material that can respond and react to new data that's being fed into it, and that's inherent in some of how this stuff is put together. The third part of that is often that a sort of broader thing about different data visualization works is that often people go to tool very quickly and actually sooner than they should necessarily, and that they think they know kind of what's in the data, and so they start making a tool around that as opposed to doing one thing that actually pulls out an interesting story or two, which then basically for us teaches us what we actually need to pursue, and that we're a little smarter at that point and can make better decisions about what the tool looks like. So in the case of the Darwin piece, I did this very mundane track changes thing, which feeds into the installation thing. But if we had gone straight to what I was describing as that third step of how could you actually build a tool that people could actually sit with and understand this, the changes and search with it and all that, if we can build a much better tool after having done that initial work. And I don't like to build that tool until we've actually done some of that that initial groundwork. Also, part of that too is this thing of sometimes you actually, like I saw a lot of this when I was doing work in the genetic space. A lot of times you make one thing, and that it teaches you something, and then basically it means you have to throw it out to move on to the next thing. And so it's a lot more, and that's simply part of the process. That it's more important to be able to build something and find something interesting quickly, and be willing to throw that out and move on to the next part of it.
Thanks again for a great talk, Ben. I just wanted to ask a little bit about your process within your office and the, say, distribution of work either between you or your employees in processes that are sort of related to more research and development as opposed to client work.
Like, what in particular?
Well,
I stand on a little platform and yell at them to code and design faster.
well, I guess what I'm curious about is about the boundary between where research is is something that you're interested in and want to sort of develop to sort of hone your craft.
Yep.
And then the client work is much more focused about delivering a very clear product. So how do you help yourself draw that line? And I'm assuming it has to do in drawing the line between client-related work and research and development.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think the main thing is that we try to keep more of, I guess, the research type stuff actually in there, because the, if not, the client work starts suffering from it. Like if you kind of do too much just one client thing after another, that you're kind of solving a bunch of problems that, you know, may not necessarily be the things that you're most charged about, or most, you know, that we'll do these other side things that help kind of feed into that process. So MacGyver is all very fun, but now Chris has a handle on doing natural language processing with Python, and doing that. That'll actually come back with other projects, and has started to in a particular case. And so we try and do some of it that way. I think also that having spent time doing, you know, PhD and postdoc and all that, that I was trying to find a mix, or, you know, continually I'm trying to find the right mix between sort of pursuing stuff that's a little bit further out than necessarily what people are, like a client is necessarily asking for right off the bat, and being able to just, you know, do some things where it's, we have a deadline and we have to execute, and we've got, you know, a week or a month or 3 months to, you know, turn something out. And so I really enjoyed having some, you know, back and forth between those, because I think there's an interesting kind of conversation between those different types of work, and that sometimes you can, you know, you know, you can think a little bit more freely on one, and then one's a little bit more directed. But actually, it's not even quite that. It's just that it's just how the research bits kind of feed into, you know, your real work. I think we should wrap it. Great. Thanks very much.